Content Podcast, Episode 158. Arts Administrator and former Director of the Canada Council for the Arts, Bob Sirman.
We're not just talking about saving the environment. What we're first and foremost trying to get people to do is care for the environment, and you can't care for the environment unless you feel part of it, unless you feel attached to it, unless you can see outside the building and understand we're not living in bubbles. And I mean by bubbles, especially that we're not living in an individual bubble, that we have social responsibility, that we make connectivity with other people, building blocks for community, for betterment of various kinds, etc.
Robert, or Bob, Sirman, served as Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts for 8 of my 21 years there. He had a distinguished career in the arts with the Canada Council, Canada's National Ballet School, the Ontario Arts Council, and Ontario's first Ministry of Culture, among many other contributions. I wanted to speak with Bob because he had a notable influence in my life in terms of engaging with art, ways of being in space, architecture, design, systems thinking, and long-term planning. So we sat down at his home in Toronto and talked about art and ecology, aesthetics, the role of art in social change, his legacy as an arts leader, and what kind of art inspires him. And he mentioned photographer Edward Burtynsky. Among other things, you'll hear a story about a meeting between our staff Green Committee, of which I was a part, and Bob, Director of the Council, about the Council's carbon footprint. This was in about 2007. And I remember that Bob listened very carefully and noted that the Council's largest carbon footprint at the time, anyway, was its energy inefficient building on Albert Street. And I was pleased to see that before Bob left as Director of the Council in 2014, that the Council had moved into, and remains in, a Gold Class A LEED certified building on Elgin Street in Ottawa. I want to thank Bob for his many contributions to the arts in Canada and to the arts community. Many seeds were planted during his tenure that have blossomed, or might yet. Here's our conversation. Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
It's nice to see you again. You were the director at the Canada Council when I was there. I was there 21 years and all, but 8 of those years was under your leadership.
Yes.
So I'm really happy to have you on the podcast, and some people might not know you, so maybe give us a really short a description of your background, where you come from, and some of the things.
So I was born in Toronto, and I've spent my entire life both in the public sector and in the not-for-profit charitable sector. I was for 5 years in the original Ministry of Culture in Ontario, then 10 years in the Ontario Arts Council, then 15 years as the co-director of the National Ballet School, and finally 8 years as the director and CEO of the Canada Council. So that's a career that spans different levels of government, but always focused on culture and what are the conditions that make or that contribute to active and rich, creative and productive life.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is that I remember conversations with you at Canada Council about um, green operations, and I remember a meeting in particular where I don't know if you remember this, but you had accepted to have a conversation with the Green Committee, and we were saying, well, what can the council do? And you said, well, one of the biggest footprints we have is our building. I don't know if you remember that, and then something happened where the council actually went into a much more environmentally friendly building. What do you remember?
Oh my, it's a wonderful kind of memory. I mean, it's a mixed memory. When I first went to the Canada Council, I was very distressed by its venue. At that particular time, we were in a high-rise office building in downtown Ottawa. There was no signage on the ground floor. We were several stories up. When you got off the elevator, you could not see outside the building. There was no indication that the organization did anything other than work in an office, because all the corridors were closed, and I thought, oh my gosh, it looks like and it feels like an insurance company with good art. And that's not what I thought an arts advocacy organization, an arts funder should look like, especially the most senior one in the country at the federal government level. So I was determined right from the beginning to have on the back burner, if ever I have an opportunity to give this organization or push this organization into something that is more in keeping with the culture of the work that people do here, and that the what can I say, the client base of the organization is committed to, I'm going to do that. And happily, that opportunity did arise, and one of the things that we were able to do addressed the issue of carbon footprint. We actually have now, or the Canada Council has now, a space in which it's impossible, even from the street, to not know something special is happening in this building, and that the Canada Council lives here. There is signage outside. There is signage above the main entryway to the building. There is a public gallery that is completely free on the ground floor, that has no barriers for entry. And there is, in addition to the elevators, a staircase that allows you to walk straight up from the first floor to the reception of the Canada Council on the second floor. All of these things were consistent in my mind with walking the talk, with trying to get vistas through the building, out the windows, to connect with the street, to connect with the city, to connect with people, etc. And we were very successful, not only in putting our own mark on that space, which is, as permanent as rented space can ever be, but actually leveraging the developer to invest more in the restoration of the Heritage House, which is one of the anchors, one of the corners of the building, and has subsequently become a restaurant. They spent more on the standard of restoration for that building than they expected to at the beginning, by realizing, oh my goodness, we have something here that will help to brand this site or this development, and that is a kind of cultural sophistication.
Plus, it was a green building as much as was possible at the time, and I think the council's still working on making it as high in the LEED system as possible. But I think that was, for me, one of the important parts of it is the council was walking its talk in terms of reducing its own footprint, knowing that that's something that everybody needs to do. But I think back at of those 8 years, and I remember your first strategic plan, and there was a lot of change needed, that needed to be seeded, and much of it has happened, the increase of the budget and all that. But it seems to me that you played a very important role in making the council more aware of its role and its relationship with the public, and who does the council serve ultimately? You talked a lot about that. Now, what I want to talk about today is the role of art in addressing social issues, and I know you have some views on that. I'd like to hear some of them in terms of how you see. There's environmental art, there's social art for social change. There's all types of different types of art, and I'm interested in the issue of climate change. And I don't necessarily think that more art about climate change is necessarily going to be the ultimate solution, but artists play an important role. So, what is the role of the artists and the arts in social change and in addressing complex issues like climate?
Well, my commitment in this field begins first with the artists and art as a form of expression. What I care about most is that artists have a voice and that artists are free to express their beliefs and what they see in the world. And why this is important is because artists are especially skilled, not just predisposed to, but trained to communicate. Because they have this capacity and this talent and this competency, they build up over time power. And this is a power to get a message across and to intervene in a way in the mindset of the public at large. And I don't mean by public at large everybody, but I mean an outside public. They're not speaking just to themselves. They're speaking to some kind of a perceived viewer, some kind of perceived public. My concern is first and foremost that the people who have this capacity and that have chosen this as a career have as much support as possible to speak their truth, whatever they care about. If they care about the environment, I really care that they have the tools to get whatever message they wish to get across on the environment. But they could also be caring about war, they could be caring about equity, they could be caring about nuclear disarmament. There are just so many things that confront us in the real world. What seems to be most important for me is that artists have and find and succeed in connecting people to the outside, to the other, to the broader universe, if I can put it that way. And I see the environment as having multiple layers of attraction in this particular quest or obsession of mine, belief, passion. And that is that we're not just talking about saving the environment. What we're first and foremost trying to get people to do is care for the environment. And you can't care for the environment unless you feel part of it, unless you feel attached to it, unless you can see outside the building and understand we're not living in bubbles. And I mean by bubbles, especially that we're not living in an individual bubble, that we have social responsibility, that we make connectivity with other people, building blocks for community, for betterment of various kinds. We are living in a time, people talk about it as neoliberalism, and there's a whole lot of language about it, but we are living in a time in which there is a lot of individualization. There is a lot of isolation. There is a lot of things supporting the idea, I'm all right, Jack. What really counts is me, my identity, my sense of self, my sense of well-being, my sense of comfort. This is the first and foremost thing I'm trying to defend or strengthen. That seems to be the overwhelming challenge that we're facing at this moment, the individualization of all of these sentiments. And the environmental crisis, if I can use that expression, is impossible to address without seeing a shared mission for society as a whole. Artists themselves are not scientists. They're not business people. They're not the ones who are actually extracting resources from the earth. They're not the ones who have the scientific capacity to develop new means of capturing carbon, let's say, or developing new technologies that we would think of as cleaner technologies. They're not the holders of traditional values like many cultures and many other professions and many other kinds of thinkers and many other kinds of workers. We are just part of a package, a society, and we need to be working together. I guess that's the easiest thing to say. We need to be working together, and that's why I think it's critical to empower artists to be able to choose freely the passions that they wish to pursue, and to develop the skills and have the resources to actually connect with other people.
And I agree with that. I think that historically there have been movements and times in the history of humanity when the arts have played a very important role of bringing people together through song and story, and that it's interesting. You talked about the relationship with nature. I think that this connection with nature is a source of many of our issues, is that we think of it as an other, as opposed to we are nature and we're one part of many forms of intelligence and many systems around us. We're quite an arrogant breed, and yet we have sensitivities that come through the arts. And yeah, I'm just wondering what an artist, there's artists listening to us now speak now, some of whom are terrified by the ecological crisis or climate change, and rightfully so, because it's not looking good at all in terms of the changes that we won't be able to address because they're baked in, that kind of challenge. Kind of advice, you just gave good advice to the artists to work together, to work collectively, but what more can artists do when we're living, and it's not the first crisis we've had, in the 60s and 70s, there was the nuclear crisis that's still there, we're always facing one or another, but now there's so many at the same time that it's like the artist could say, well, I'm just going to say what I think and then hope it all works out. We need to do more.
Well, it's a very challenging question because one has to be careful about not imposing on artists responsibility for somehow solving problems or turning the course of events around that they were not responsible for creating in the first place. We have to be careful that we don't think of artists as having a heavier burden than other members of society, other elements, other dimensions of societal life, in the economy, for example, or in politics. Well, I'm very concerned that that we don't make the making of art. We don't put on the making of art a burden beyond what we think of as being the formative basis of artistic expression, and that is trying to find some way of mastering, if you'll pardon the expression, various communicative media like sound and color and form and three-dimensional space and movement. That all of those things are inherent in the history of artistic development as long as we know. From the very beginning, the very first signs that one has when one looks in prehistory at the making of tools, the making of blades or cutting materials from stone, there's something astounding about them, and that is their symmetry. It's impossible not to recognize that this symmetry was imposed in the making of these tools, highly functional objects. And there's no reason for us to doubt that this represents in some way an innate capacity within our genes, however one thinks of that, an innate capacity to identify, and wait for it, concepts of beauty or concepts of an ideal form. There's much about what artists pursue in their work with words, poetry, sound, color, form, that reflect this innate sense of an ideal form or an ideal way of achieving or expressing or experiencing something, attaching these principles and these capacities to specific issues, values, however one wants to take things like the environment or survival or sustainability of the planet or diversity of life forms. However one wants to take these specific subjects and define them in terms that have to do with concepts of expression, that's what artists need to be focusing on. That's what artists are excellent at. That's what they do. And we have to think of that, or those standards of excellence, not simply in, well, how convincing is the message? It's how well can they connect and bring out from other people the sense of what it means to be human and what the burden of humanity is in caring for the world, in connecting with other human beings, in building a societal sense of identity, to reinforce a sense of place and the individual's connection to place, to think of things as being productive in terms of the well-being of the individual and the well-being of the group and the well-being of the earth, the well-being of life on the planet, of the other species that we share the planet with. All of this actually, for artists, has to somehow be channeled through whatever these media are that artists on a day-to-day basis employ or harness or, I use the word master, experiment with and use in making the work itself, in making the artistic experience that the public is going to share with them.
I hear you, and I struggle with what you just said. I agree with it, but I think society needs artists, and we don't want to put undue burden on artists who are already struggling to make a living, and we're coming out of COVID, and there's all kinds of challenges.
Absolutely.
And I'm aware of many of those things. And yet the world needs the connecting tissue that the artists bring in terms of finding paths forward, conciliation, whatever it is, the process that the artist can bring to society. And so my dilemma is I feel like the world is on fire, and it is. and that we're in a beyond what one would call a crisis. We're in an existential moment as a species, and so artists are stepping up. I'm not saying they're not. I see the work. I hear
Absolutely.
the discourse, and I love what you said. You know, resources for artists. What are they missing that to have the work be either more impactful or more connected, or to have them feel more confident in working in this context? Because it's really difficult. It's really almost impossible to work day to day knowing the reality of our the issues that we face, and they're not just environmental issues, although ultimately everything is environmental. But so I thank you for that, because I remember you talking about this at the council back 15 years ago, and I thought you were brilliant. And I said, how are we going to do this? I mean, we're already doing it because Canada Council and other agencies have been supporting so-called excellence. I don't like that word, but we use it with a large frame.
And a small e.
And a small e. But I'm still puzzled about how we can bring, and not just financial resources, but the resources and the increase the place of arts in around social issues. You talked a lot about having the arts be at the table of social issues, and they are there. But how can we?
I'll cite someone like Ed Bertinsky, a photographer who is very well known, and so your listeners would be conscious of the work. The critical thing for me is that Bertinsky, in documenting the degradation that human intervention, industrialization, etc., globalization, etc., that the degradation that humanity has brought to the natural world. In documenting that, he does it in a manner which satisfies certain aesthetic principles that are attractive and beautiful. He's found a way to tell a really serious and negative, to have a very negative content attractive to the viewer, and challenge the viewer to figure out where they stand on this. Is this something we want? And is this something that we're prepared to simply accept passively? Or is this indeed a wake-up call for change? I love the tension, because it's not didactic in the way that a scientist reporting on the same findings, it's not didactic in the way that report would be read by a public. It's not didactic in the way that journalists, all of these people are absolutely critical to this movement, but the way journalists try to bring scientific information and historical fact and various political realities to the consciousness of the average reader. It uses other strategies and other techniques, and I am excited about the potential of that, without thinking, oh, we'll never solve it without the art. I think what we're trying to say is we need all of these players to be at the table, and that the Bertinskys of the world have done a real service to us in bringing many, many more people into the galleries and into the spaces and into the theaters to have a consciousness of how severe the human intervention has been in this so-called new era of an Anthropocene. This is like critically helpful in advancing or speeding up the recognition. Is there contradiction here? There is big contradiction here. How can it be so beautiful to look at degradation? How can it be so beautiful? And yet, if that's what it takes to get people to stare at reality, at what the new reality is, as the planet dries up and floods over and melts, and like all of the horrors that we're seeing, species dying off and people behaving in without conscious, bringing more consciousness. The thing about the arts and the thing about art is that it demands attention. When you hear the music, you block out other things. When you hear the words of poetry, you're not thinking of other words. When you see the painting in the gallery, you're not looking at the edges of the room. You're staring at that painting. When you're in the cinema, you're fully involved in the world of the cinematic narrative that's pulling you to the screen. This is needed with the environmental movement. It needs attention. And who, as a category of beast, who uses attention more forcefully than artists? They are the most skilled at making us look, at making us listen, at making us feel, to the exclusion, for the period of the artistic experience, to the exclusion of other noise in the system. We want those moments to be a more compelling, more active, more impactful part of everyone's life.
I was going to ask you what was some of your legacy as a cultural worker, but I think you just answered it in the sense of what you've been fighting for all these years. In terms of the freedom of artists and the role of art, and not role in this in like you say, a didactic way, but that process that the arts brings to society, constantly renewing, constantly challenging, constantly. But maybe you can answer the question: what do you consider to be your biggest legacy as in your career as an arts and culture?
It's very hard. I have been fortunate to have had two quite special experiences with physical space in building a new campus for the National Ballet School in Toronto, which I worked on for 13 years, and that transformed that organization into what I really honestly believe is the finest facility for professional dance training in the world. And as we talked earlier, moving the Canada Council, which is a bureaucratic agency, well, not quite agency, but of the government of Canada, to show that you could be different, that you don't have to be looking like an insurance company with good art on the walls, and both of these have to do with space as a legacy. I do believe that architecture is an art form, and I do believe that architecture can promote and can work against a healthy relationship with the outside world, with the environment. And I've seen both. I've seen both outcomes. I've seen architecture which seems to cut people off from nature, and that makes them feel more isolated, and given them a cooler distance from other people and from other aspects of their lives. And I've seen architecture that has brought people together and opened up possibilities and brought light and potential to people's lives. So part of what I'm happy that I got to do in my career was to work on two projects in which I do think that there was something successful in advancing the mandate of both of those organizations through architectural development and through a lasting physical footprint that was strongly aesthetically. I think too that what I hoped to leave as a legacy was a certain kind of faith and trust in collaborative decision making. Here, it's very hard to really defend that you really changed anything, because of course what happens is that leadership changes and you are replaced by other people, and the culture of the organization and culture of decision making changes in a way that you can't control. But I do think that in my career, I believe very deeply in a certain way of working with other people and a way of reducing hierarchy, all these crazy titles that people give each other, and all the ways they seem to wish to elevate themselves through cutting themselves off and through making them seem less engaged in the actual content and caring of what people do in the workforce. I really wanted to and tried to pursue a much more collaborative workplace in all of the organizations where I had a voice to do.
So we're going to wrap up, Bob. I usually ask my guests if there is one thing they're reading or seeing or that's influenced them recently that they would like to just put out there as a recommendation or something that you think people might enjoy in a work of art or in something that you're reading right now.
It's a difficult question for me because I don't have a favorite. Mm-hmm. I've mentioned Bertinsky as something that people would recognize and allow them to wrestle with the contradictions of artists actively engaged in the environmental crisis. I am deeply, deeply supportive of any work that tries to connect people to a bigger universe. Any work that tries to have people or encourage people to empathize with other people, with their plights in the world, with the complications of finding the right answers. Anything that helps to encourage listening and not just demanding that artists say things that support our own views, not just asking for us to be agreed with, but challenging us. One of the things that is astounding me in my retirement years is that I have more opportunity to read, and as I read, I keep finding that there are a lot of people who make a lot of sense, and they're not all making the same sense, but they are making sense, and it's helping me to respect the extraordinary range of views and opportunities and talents and potential that exists. At a certain point, you have to make decisions for yourself. At a certain point, you have to say, no, I don't think this is the right direction to go in, and I'm going to follow this particular course. I'm not wanting to cite any particular thing as kind of the answer or the thing that I think people should be most caring about. What I would promote, really, is that people actually engage with art forms, with arts experience, that they actually go to the theater, they actually go to an art gallery, they actually go to the movies, they actually think, that they read, they read fiction and they read nonfiction, and that we just don't close our minds to any particular form of creative and thoughtful expression. We're not the only people, artists, who are thinkers. Far from it. We're part of an enormous culture of creative minds. When the Canada Council was formed, it was originally the Canada Council for the Arts, Humanities. It wasn't just for art. It was for academic thought, It was for intellectual thought. The people who created the Canada Council thought that they were finding a body to support intellectual activity, a free kind of intellectual activity, and they saw university research and artistic research as being on the same plane. We really need to open our minds to the possibilities that makes for us.
Well, thank you, Bob Sirman, for everything you've done for this country, and for speaking with me today. And I will think about it, because you've said a lot that I think others needed to hear, because your experience in the arts is just sort of so I would say complete. not perfect.
No, not perfect. My God.
But complete in the sense that you've been true to yourself. I've heard you speak over the years, and I just like the coherence and the depth.
Well, it's interesting that you're doing this, because even having this little conversation, I feel so inarticulate. But having the conversation again makes us focus, and makes us think and pay attention to the things that we really care about.